In October 1923, 3 hunters pursuing a wounded deer through the dense forests of Mount Carmel, New Hampshire, stumbled upon a discovery that would force authorities to confront one of New England's most carefully buried secrets. What they found scattered across a hillside clearing would lead investigators to uncover evidence of 291 people who vanished without a trace between 1897 and 1910, all connected to a religious community that called itself New Eden. The skeletal remains, some still partially clothed in the plain garments favored by religious sects of the era, were arranged in what appeared to be deliberate patterns. State investigators who arrived 3 days later documented fragments of personal belongings, wedding rings, spectacles, children's shoes, and religious medallions that told the story of entire families who had simply disappeared from the historical record. Before we descend deeper into this chilling tale of faith corrupted and trust betrayed, this story isn't for everyone. Only those brave enough to confront the darkest chapters of New England's hidden history should continue. If you're ready to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these forgotten victims remain silent, hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. We're building a global community of people who believe these stories must be told. The man responsible for orchestrating this systematic elimination of human lives was Jeremiah Stonehurst, a charismatic preacher who arrived in the remote mountain community of Cedar Falls in the spring of 1895. Standing 6 feet tall with piercing blue eyes and a voice that could fill a valley, Stonehurst possessed the rare combination of intellectual sophistication and raw magnetism that allowed him to command absolute devotion from his followers. Stonehurst claimed to have received divine visions during his travels through the Western Territories, visions that revealed to him the location of humanity's final sanctuary before the coming apocalypse. Cedar Falls, he proclaimed, had been chosen by divine providence as the site where the faithful would gather to await their translation to paradise. The isolated location, accessible only by a single winding mountain road, would protect the chosen ones from the corruption and violence of the outside world. What made Stonehurst particularly dangerous was his ability to present his radical theology with the scholarly authority of a seminary graduate. His sermons referenced obscure biblical passages and apocalyptic texts with the precision of a trained theologian, lending credibility to his increasingly extreme interpretations of divine will. He spoke of purification through suffering, of the necessity of complete surrender to divine authority, and of the blessed reward that awaited those willing to sacrifice everything for their faith. The Stonehurst family consisted of more than just Jeremiah and his devoted wife Martha. Their son Samuel, barely 20 when the family arrived in Cedar Falls, had inherited his father's commanding presence and his mother's calculating intelligence. Daughter Rebecca, 2 years younger than Samuel, possessed an unusual interest in medical texts and anatomical studies that would later prove instrumental to the family's operations. Martha Stonehurst presented herself as the perfect complement to her husband's spiritual authority. Where Jeremiah inspired with grand visions and theological complexity, Martha provided practical guidance and maternal comfort to the women and children who joined their community. She organized the daily routines of communal life, managed the distribution of resources, and served as confessor to those struggling with doubts about their new way of life. The extended Stonehurst network included Martha's brother Thomas Whitmore, who had served as a clerk in the county records office before joining the family in Cedar Falls. Thomas brought with him an intimate knowledge of local bureaucratic procedures and the ability to create or modify official documents when circumstances required. His wife Elizabeth had worked as a nurse in Boston before her marriage, providing the family with medical knowledge that complemented Rebecca's anatomical interests. What distinguished the Stonehurst operation from other religious communities of the era was the systematic precision with which they identified and recruited vulnerable individuals. Rather than relying solely on evangelical fervor to attract converts, the family employed a sophisticated network of contacts throughout New England who identified potential targets among the desperate and dispossessed. These scouts, often traveling merchants or seasonal workers, would report back to Cedar Falls about families facing financial ruin, widows struggling to support their children, or immigrants seeking new opportunities in America. The information was carefully recorded in ledgers that documented each potential recruit's circumstances, relationships, and likelihood of being missed if they disappeared. The initial approach to potential victims followed a carefully rehearsed pattern. A well-dressed stranger, usually claiming to represent a charitable organization or employment agency, would appear at the target's home with an offer that seemed too good to refuse. Steady work, comfortable housing, and spiritual guidance were promised to those willing to relocate to a Christian community in the mountains where their faith would be rewarded with prosperity and security. For families facing eviction or starvation, the promise of immediate relief and long-term security proved irresistible. The stranger would provide transportation vouchers, small amounts of cash for immediate needs, and detailed instructions for reaching Cedar Falls. Most importantly, potential recruits were told that their commitment to joining the community must remain secret until their arrival, as jealous neighbors might attempt to interfere with their opportunity for salvation. The remote location of Cedar Falls made it the perfect setting for the Stonehurst family's activities. The nearest town of any size was Millbrook, located 27 miles down a treacherous mountain road that became impassable during winter months. Communication with the outside world depended on a single telegraph line that frequently suffered damage from storms and falling trees. Local authorities in Millbrook consisted of Sheriff William Hayes, a man more concerned with maintaining peace among the established families than investigating the affairs of religious communities in the mountains. Hayes had developed a comfortable arrangement with several influential families in the county, including the Whitmores, and saw no benefit in asking difficult questions about activities that generated no visible problems for his jurisdiction. The isolation that protected the Stonehurst operation also served their carefully constructed mythology about divine separation from worldly corruption. New arrivals were told that their previous lives represented a form of spiritual death, and that their rebirth in New Eden required the complete abandonment of all connections to their former existence. Letters to family members or friends were forbidden as manifestations of insufficient faith and commitment to their new spiritual family. As the first winter approached in 1896, the Stonehurst community had grown to include 43 individuals representing 12 families who had responded to the promise of sanctuary and salvation. What none of these faithful pilgrims understood was that their journey to Cedar Falls represented not the beginning of their spiritual transformation, but the final chapter of their earthly existence. The systematic excavation of the New Eden property during the weeks following the raid revealed evidence that confirmed the most horrifying aspects of Sarah Mitchell's testimony while uncovering additional crimes that had not been previously documented. Morrison's forensic team worked methodically through the underground complex, cataloging remains and personal belongings that told the story of hundreds of individuals who had disappeared without trace over the course of 13 years. The discovery of Jeremiah Stonehurst's personal journals provided investigators with detailed documentation of the family's criminal evolution from opportunistic murder to systematic elimination operations. The entries revealed the psychological progression that had transformed a charismatic religious leader into a calculating predator who viewed human beings as resources to be exploited and disposed of according to operational requirements. Martha Stonehurst's meticulous financial records, hidden in a concealed vault beneath the main house, documented the precise monetary value that the family had assigned to each victim based on their assets, skills, and potential threat to operational security. The ledgers revealed that the family had generated profits exceeding $400,000 through their systematic murder and theft operations. The escape attempt mounted by Rebecca Stonehurst during transport to federal custody demonstrated the family's continued dangerous capabilities even after their capture. Her use of concealed medical implements to attack her guards resulted in serious injuries to 2 officers before she was subdued, providing additional evidence of the violent tendencies that had characterized the family's criminal activities. Thomas Whitmore's cooperation with investigators, motivated by his desire to avoid execution, provided crucial information about the family's network of accomplices throughout New England who had facilitated their operations through recruitment, transportation, and disposal services. His detailed confession implicated dozens of individuals in supporting roles that had enabled the family's crimes to continue for over a decade. The forensic examination of victim remains revealed evidence of systematic torture and medical experimentation that exceeded even Morrison's expectations regarding the depravity of the family's activities. Rebecca Stonehurst's unauthorized surgical procedures and pharmaceutical experiments had prolonged the suffering of victims while advancing her understanding of human anatomy and pain tolerance limits. Samuel Stonehurst's attempt to escape federal custody during his transfer to trial resulted in a violent confrontation that ended with his death and the deaths of 3 law enforcement officers. His final act of defiance confirmed the family's willingness to use extreme violence to avoid accountability for their crimes, while eliminating one of the primary perpetrators before he could provide additional testimony about their operations. The investigation of the family's recruitment network revealed the sophisticated methods they had employed to identify and approach vulnerable individuals throughout New England. The discovery of detailed profiles documenting potential victims' financial circumstances, family connections, and psychological vulnerabilities provided disturbing insight into the calculated nature of their targeting strategies. Morrison's analysis of the physical evidence collected from the underground facilities revealed engineering sophistication that demonstrated long-term planning and substantial financial investment in creating efficient processing and disposal capabilities. The complex included specialized chambers for interrogation, medical experimentation, and systematic dismemberment that reflected years of refinement and improvement. The family's correspondence with accomplices and contacts revealed the extent of corruption that had enabled their operations to continue without detection by local authorities. The letters documented payments to law enforcement officials, government clerks, and business associates who had provided protection, false documentation, and disposal services in exchange for monetary compensation. If you're struggling to comprehend how a family could systematically murder nearly 300 people while maintaining the facade of Christian devotion, you're witnessing one of the most chilling examples of evil hiding behind religious authority in American history. This story represents more than historical curiosity, it's a warning about the dangers of unchecked authority and isolated communities where accountability disappears. Share this video with someone who needs to understand how easily trust can be exploited by those who prey on faith and desperation. Hit that like button to support our commitment to exposing these buried truths, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our investigations into the crimes that shaped our nation's hidden history. The psychological evaluation of the surviving family members revealed complex personality disorders and shared delusions that had enabled them to rationalize mass murder as religious duty while maintaining their self-image as devout Christians. The clinical analysis provided important insights into the psychology of organized criminal enterprises that exploit religious institutions and isolated communities. The discovery of detailed victim profiles in Martha Stonehurst's personal files revealed the systematic approach the family had used to evaluate potential targets based on their vulnerability, assets, and likelihood of being missed by law enforcement or family members. The documentation showed that victim selection had been based on calculated risk-benefit analysis rather than random opportunity or religious criteria. The family's medical experimentation records, despite significant destruction attempts, provided evidence of unauthorized surgical procedures, pharmaceutical testing, and anatomical studies that had been conducted on living victims over the course of several years. Rebecca Stonehurst's clinical documentation revealed a level of systematic cruelty that shocked even experienced investigators. The financial investigation revealed that the family had invested their criminal profits in legitimate business enterprises throughout New England, creating a network of assets and income sources that would have supported their operations indefinitely if their crimes had remained undetected. The scope of their financial empire demonstrated the success of their systematic approach to converting human lives into monetary wealth. Morrison's final report on the Stonehurst case documented 291 confirmed victims whose deaths could be directly attributed to the family's elimination operations, while acknowledging that the actual number of victims was likely significantly higher due to incomplete records and destroyed evidence. The investigation represented one of the most comprehensive examinations of organized serial murder in American criminal history. The broader implications of the Stonehurst case extended beyond the immediate crimes to reveal systemic weaknesses in law enforcement coordination and oversight that had enabled the family to operate with impunity across multiple jurisdictions. Morrison's recommendations for improved investigative procedures and interagency cooperation would influence criminal justice policies for decades. The family's systematic destruction of victim identities through false documentation and record manipulation had made it impossible to identify many of their victims, leaving dozens of families without closure regarding the fate of missing relatives. The investigation's efforts to restore victim identities and notify surviving family members represented an important aspect of seeking justice for the forgotten dead. The physical evidence collected from the New Eden property filled an entire warehouse and required years of analysis to fully catalogue and understand. The scope and detail of the material provided unprecedented documentation of systematic criminal activity that would serve as a case study for law enforcement training and academic research for generations. The capture and investigation of the Stonehurst family marked the end of one of the most prolific and sophisticated criminal enterprises in American history, while establishing important precedents for addressing organized crime that exploited religious institutions and isolated communities to commit systematic murder and theft on an industrial scale. The trial of Jeremiah and Martha Stonehurst began in Boston Federal Court on March 12, 1906, drawing unprecedented public attention to a case that would establish important legal precedents for prosecuting organized criminal enterprises that operated across state boundaries. The prosecution team, led by Federal Attorney General William Morrison, presented evidence that documented the systematic nature of the family's crimes while revealing the sophisticated methods they had employed to avoid detection. The legal proceedings faced significant challenges due to the complexity of proving crimes that had occurred over more than a decade and involved victims whose identities had been systematically obscured through false documentation and record destruction. The prosecution's strategy focused on using Thomas Whitmore's detailed confession, Sarah Mitchell's eyewitness testimony, and the physical evidence collected from New Eden to establish a comprehensive pattern of criminal activity. Jeremiah Stonehurst's defense team, funded by the substantial assets the family had accumulated through their criminal activities, attempted to portray their client as a sincere religious leader whose community had been the victim of persecution by authorities who misunderstood their unconventional practices. The defense strategy required explaining away the massive physical evidence of systematic murder while portraying witness testimony as unreliable or motivated by personal vendettas. Martha Stonehurst's separate trial focused on her role as the operational manager of the family's criminal enterprise, with prosecutors arguing that her detailed financial records and systematic documentation of victim assets demonstrated conscious participation in mass murder for profit. Her defense team attempted to portray her as a devoted wife who had been manipulated by her husband's religious delusions and had no knowledge of the true nature of their activities. The testimony of surviving community members provided crucial evidence about the family's methods for controlling and manipulating their victims, while revealing the psychological techniques they had employed to maintain order within their isolated community. These witnesses described a systematic program of indoctrination, surveillance, and intimidation that had made resistance or escape virtually impossible for most community members. The broader investigation into the family's accomplice network resulted in dozens of additional arrests throughout New England, as federal authorities pursued individuals who had facilitated the Stonehurst operations through recruitment, transportation, document falsification, and disposal services. The scope of the criminal conspiracy shocked prosecutors who had initially expected to deal with a relatively isolated criminal enterprise. Sheriff William Hayes faced federal charges for his failure to investigate suspicious activities in his jurisdiction, while evidence emerged that he had received regular payments from the Stonehurst network in exchange for ignoring reports of missing persons and suspicious deaths. His conviction established important precedents for holding local law enforcement accountable for corruption that enabled organized criminal activity. The financial investigation revealed that the family's criminal profits had been invested in legitimate business enterprises throughout New England, creating a complex web of assets that required extensive legal proceedings to trace and recover. The effort to identify and seize these assets provided crucial funding for victim compensation while ensuring that the family could not benefit from their crimes. Rebecca Stonehurst's medical experiments became the focus of a separate investigation that revealed systematic violations of medical ethics and unauthorized human experimentation that had contributed to the suffering and deaths of numerous victims. Her activities represented some of the most disturbing aspects of the family's criminal enterprise and provided evidence for additional charges related to torture and medical malpractice. The prosecution's presentation of physical evidence from the underground facilities provided jury members with graphic documentation of the family's crimes while revealing the systematic nature of their elimination operations. The detailed forensic analysis of victim remains and personal belongings created compelling evidence that contradicted defense claims about the religious nature of the community's activities. Thomas Whitmore's cooperation with authorities extended beyond his initial confession to include detailed testimony about the recruitment methods, processing procedures, and disposal techniques that the family had refined over years of criminal activity. His willingness to provide comprehensive information about their operations was motivated by plea agreements that allowed him to avoid execution in exchange for complete cooperation. The trial proceedings revealed the sophisticated planning and long-term investment that had enabled the family to operate with impunity for over a decade while systematically eliminating hundreds of victims. The evidence demonstrated that their crimes represented calculated business decisions rather than impulsive violence or religious fanaticism. The psychological evaluation of Jeremiah Stonehurst conducted during the trial revealed complex personality disorders and grandiose delusions that had enabled him to rationalize mass murder as divine mission while maintaining his self-image as a righteous religious leader. The clinical analysis provided important insights into the psychology of charismatic criminals who exploit religious authority to commit systematic crimes. The impact of the Stonehurst case extended beyond the immediate legal proceedings to influence federal policies regarding oversight of religious communities and coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating missing persons cases. Morrison's recommendations for improved investigative procedures and interagency communication would become standard practices for addressing organized criminal activity. The media coverage of the trial brought national attention to the dangers of isolated religious communities that operated without external oversight or accountability. The case became a catalyst for legislative reforms designed to prevent similar criminal enterprises from exploiting religious freedom protections to commit systematic crimes. The conviction of Jeremiah and Martha Stonehurst on multiple counts of murder, fraud, and conspiracy resulted in death sentences that reflected the scope and brutality of their crimes. The legal proceedings established important precedents for prosecuting organized criminal enterprises while providing a measure of justice for the hundreds of victims whose lives had been systematically destroyed. The broader investigation into the family's accomplice network continued for several years after the primary convictions, as federal authorities worked to identify and prosecute all individuals who had participated in or facilitated the criminal enterprise. The scope of the conspiracy revealed systemic corruption and criminal collaboration that extended far beyond the immediate Stonehurst family. The recovery and identification of victim remains continued long after the trial concluded, as investigators worked to restore identities to the forgotten dead while providing closure to surviving family members who had spent years wondering about the fate of missing relatives. The effort to honor the victims represented an important aspect of seeking justice for crimes that had attempted to erase their very existence. The Stonehurst case established important legal precedents for addressing organized crime that exploited religious institutions and isolated communities to commit systematic murder and theft. The comprehensive investigation and prosecution provided a model for future cases involving complex criminal conspiracies that operated across multiple jurisdictions and extended over many years. The legacy of the investigation extended beyond the immediate convictions to influence law enforcement training, investigative procedures, and interagency coordination that would help prevent similar criminal enterprises from operating with impunity in the future. The case represented a watershed moment in the development of modern techniques for addressing organized criminal activity that exploited social institutions and geographic isolation. The execution of Jeremiah and Martha Stonehurst on November 15, 1907, marked the end of a criminal enterprise that had claimed 291 documented lives while leaving scars on communities throughout New England that would persist for generations. Their final moments, witnessed by a carefully selected group of officials and victim family members, provided a measure of closure for some while serving as a stark reminder of the price of unchecked evil disguised as religious authority. Jeremiah Stonehurst's final statement, delivered from the gallows with the same commanding voice that had once attracted devoted followers, contained no expression of remorse for his crimes but instead proclaimed his innocence while claiming that history would vindicate his divine mission. His inability to acknowledge the reality of his actions demonstrated the psychological mechanisms that had enabled him to rationalize mass murder as religious duty throughout his criminal career. Martha Stonehurst's execution followed immediately after her husband's, and her final words consisted of a prayer for forgiveness that seemed directed more toward maintaining her self-image as a devout Christian than expressing genuine remorse for the hundreds of lives she had helped destroy. Her death marked the end of the operational leadership that had transformed religious community life into a systematic program of exploitation and murder. The disposition of the Stonehurst family assets, accumulated through 13 years of systematic theft and murder, required extensive legal proceedings that continued for several years after the executions. The recovered wealth, totaling over $600,000 in contemporary currency, was distributed among surviving family members of identified victims while funding memorial efforts and support services for affected communities. The New Eden property was purchased by the state of New Hampshire and transformed into a memorial park dedicated to the victims of the Stonehurst family's crimes. The underground facilities where so many innocent people had suffered and died were sealed permanently, while the surface grounds became a place of remembrance where visitors could honor the memory of those whose lives had been systematically destroyed by calculated evil. Sarah Mitchell's courage in providing testimony that enabled the prosecution of the Stonehurst family was recognized through a special commendation from the federal government, while her detailed account of life within the community became an important historical document that provided insights into the psychology of victimization and survival. Her willingness to relive traumatic experiences for the sake of justice represented one of the few positive outcomes from the tragedy. The investigation's impact on law enforcement procedures extended far beyond the immediate case to influence federal policies regarding interagency cooperation, missing persons investigations, and oversight of religious communities. Chief Inspector Morrison's comprehensive report became required reading for federal investigators and provided a template for addressing organized criminal enterprises that exploited social institutions to commit systematic crimes. The broader network of accomplices who had facilitated the Stonehurst operations faced varying degrees of punishment based on their level of involvement and cooperation with authorities. Thomas Whitmore received a life sentence in exchange for his comprehensive testimony, while dozens of other individuals faced prison terms that reflected their roles in enabling 13 years of systematic murder and theft. The psychological study of the Stonehurst case provided important insights into the mechanisms that enable charismatic criminals to attract followers and maintain control over isolated communities. The analysis revealed patterns of manipulation, indoctrination, and social control that would inform future research into cult behavior and organized criminal activity that exploited religious authority. The legislative reforms prompted by the Stonehurst case included new requirements for oversight of religious communities, improved coordination between law enforcement agencies investigating missing persons cases, and enhanced penalties for crimes that exploited religious institutions or isolated communities. These reforms reflected society's recognition that religious freedom protections could not be allowed to shield systematic criminal activity. The memorial services held for the 291 identified victims represented an important step in restoring dignity to individuals whose identities had been systematically erased by their murderers. The ceremonies, attended by surviving family members and community leaders throughout New England, provided opportunities for collective mourning while ensuring that the victims would be remembered as individuals rather than statistics. The educational legacy of the Stonehurst case included its incorporation into law enforcement training programs, academic courses on criminal psychology, and public awareness campaigns about the dangers of isolated communities that operated without external oversight. The comprehensive documentation of the family's methods and motivations provided valuable resources for preventing similar criminal enterprises in the future. What do you think about this chilling tale of systematic evil disguised as religious devotion? The Stonehurst family's ability to murder 291 innocent people while maintaining their facade of Christian leadership serves as a permanent reminder that evil often hides behind masks of authority and respectability. Share your thoughts in the comments below about how communities can protect themselves from predators who exploit faith and trust. If you found this investigation into one of America's most horrifying family crime sprees both disturbing and important, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the dark chapters of history that authorities tried to bury. The long-term impact of the Stonehurst case on the Cedar Falls community included the gradual abandonment of the area as residents sought to escape the memories and associations connected to 13 years of systematic horror. The mountain settlement that had once provided isolated sanctuary for criminal activity became a ghost town whose empty buildings served as monuments to the dangers of unchecked authority and community isolation. The historical analysis of the Stonehurst case revealed important lessons about the social conditions that enable systematic criminal activity to flourish, including economic desperation, social isolation, and inadequate oversight of institutions that claim religious or charitable purposes. These insights informed policy discussions about preventing similar tragedies while protecting legitimate religious freedom and community autonomy. The forensic techniques developed during the investigation of the Stonehurst crimes contributed to advances in criminal investigation methods that would prove valuable for addressing future cases involving organized criminal activity, mass murder, and systematic evidence destruction. The comprehensive documentation and analysis provided important precedents for handling complex criminal conspiracies. The international attention attracted by the Stonehurst case included coverage in European newspapers and academic journals that analyzed the crimes as an example of how criminal enterprises could exploit social institutions and geographic isolation to commit systematic atrocities. The case became a subject of study for criminologists and sociologists seeking to understand the mechanisms that enable organized evil. The final legacy of the Stonehurst family crimes rests in the permanent reminder they provide about the constant vigilance required to protect vulnerable individuals from those who would exploit their desperation, faith, and trust for criminal purposes. The 291 victims whose lives were systematically destroyed serve as enduring testimony to the price of allowing evil to operate without accountability, while their memory demands that society remain alert to the dangers that lurk behind facades of authority and respectability. The transformation of horror into historical lesson represents the ultimate triumph over the Stonehurst family's attempt to erase their victims from memory and meaning. Their crimes, fully documented and permanently remembered, serve as warnings that help protect future generations from similar predators while ensuring that the innocent dead are never forgotten or diminished by the evil that destroyed their lives. The transformation of Cedar Falls from a struggling mountain settlement into the New Eden community required more than religious fervor. It demanded the systematic dismantling of existing social structures and their replacement with a hierarchy that placed the Stonehurst family at the apex of all spiritual and temporal authority. Jeremiah Stonehurst's first strategic move involved purchasing the abandoned Miller property, which included a large farmhouse, several outbuildings, and nearly 200 acres of forested land. The transaction, handled through Thomas Whitmore's connections in the county records office, was structured to obscure the true extent of the family's financial resources and their long-term intentions for the property. The existing residents of Cedar Falls, primarily subsistence farmers and seasonal loggers, initially welcomed the arrival of the Stonehurst family and their followers. The newcomers brought much-needed cash into the local economy and demonstrated a willingness to purchase supplies and services from established merchants. More importantly, they presented themselves as devout Christians whose presence would elevate the moral character of the entire community. Martha Stonehurst proved particularly skilled at integrating the family into the social fabric of Cedar Falls. She organized prayer meetings for the local women, contributed generously to church repairs, and offered medical assistance to families who could not afford professional care. Her genuine knowledge of herbal remedies and basic medical procedures earned her a reputation as a healing woman whose services were both effective and affordable. The gradual expansion of the New Eden community followed a carefully planned schedule that avoided attracting unwanted attention from local authorities or neighboring settlements. New arrivals were spaced weeks apart and integrated into the existing population gradually, allowing the Stonehurst family to assess each individual's potential value to their operation while maintaining the appearance of organic growth. Samuel Stonehurst assumed responsibility for the physical security of the expanding community, organizing work crews that constructed additional housing and improved the road connecting the settlement to the outside world. His projects included the excavation of root cellars and storage facilities that would later serve purposes far removed from food preservation. Rebecca Stonehurst established herself as the community's educator, teaching reading and arithmetic to the children while indoctrinating them with the family's unique interpretation of Christian theology. Her lessons emphasized absolute obedience to divine authority as represented by her father, the sinful nature of questioning established order, and the blessed reward that awaited those who demonstrated perfect faith through complete submission. The community's economic foundation rested on a combination of agriculture, logging, and crafts production that generated sufficient revenue to maintain the appearance of prosperity while funding the family's expanding operations. However, the most significant source of income came from the systematic appropriation of resources brought by new arrivals, who were required to contribute all personal possessions to the common treasury as evidence of their commitment to communal living. What outsiders perceived as a thriving religious community was actually an elaborate mechanism for the acquisition and processing of human resources. The Stonehurst family had created a system that could identify, attract, isolate, and ultimately eliminate vulnerable individuals while maintaining the facade of spiritual sanctuary that protected them from outside interference. The transformation of new arrivals from hopeful pilgrims to potential victims followed a predictable pattern of psychological manipulation and social isolation. During their first weeks in New Eden, newcomers were overwhelmed with attention, affection, and apparent acceptance that contrasted sharply with the rejection and hardship they had experienced in their previous lives. Jeremiah Stonehurst personally welcomed each new arrival with a ceremony that combined religious ritual with practical orientation to community life. These ceremonies served multiple purposes. They established his spiritual authority over the newcomers, created emotional bonds between new arrivals and the community, and provided opportunities to assess each individual's psychological vulnerabilities and potential resistance to the family's ultimate intentions. The systematic erosion of individual identity began immediately upon arrival in New Eden. Personal possessions were surrendered to the common treasury, family relationships were redefined according to the community's spiritual hierarchy, and previous names were often replaced with biblical appellations chosen by Jeremiah Stonehurst himself. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, you're not alone in recognizing the calculated evil that masqueraded as divine inspiration. Share this video with someone who appreciates true crime stories that expose the darkest chapters of American history. Hit that like button to support our efforts to bring these forgotten victim stories to light, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss our investigations into the mysteries that authorities tried to bury. The psychological conditioning that prepared new arrivals for their eventual fate required months of careful manipulation designed to break down individual resistance while strengthening group cohesion. The Stonehurst family understood that their success depended on their ability to convince victims that their elimination served a higher spiritual purpose that transcended earthly concerns about survival. The first deliberate elimination of a New Eden community member occurred in March 1898, 17 months after the Stonehurst family's arrival in Cedar Falls. The victim was Heinrich Müller, a German immigrant who had joined the community with his wife Anna and their 3 young children after losing their farm to creditors in Pennsylvania. Heinrich had begun expressing doubts about certain aspects of Jeremiah Stonehurst's increasingly radical theology, particularly the preacher's claims about receiving direct communication from divine sources. More dangerously, Heinrich had started asking questions about the fate of previous community members who had supposedly been called away on special missions but never returned to New Eden. The method chosen for Heinrich's elimination revealed the sophisticated planning that characterized the Stonehurst family's operations. During a community meeting focused on spiritual purification, Jeremiah announced that Heinrich had been selected for a special pilgrimage to a sacred site in the Western Mountains where he would commune with divine forces and receive revelations crucial to the community's future. The pilgrimage, Jeremiah explained, required Heinrich to travel alone and maintain complete silence about his mission until his return. The community gathered for a farewell ceremony that combined religious ritual with practical preparations for what Heinrich believed would be a journey of spiritual discovery but which the Stonehurst family knew would be his final departure from the world of the living. Samuel Stonehurst accompanied Heinrich on the first day of his supposed pilgrimage, ostensibly to guide him to the proper trailhead but actually to lead him to a remote location where the family had prepared facilities for processing unwanted community members. The site, located in a natural depression surrounded by dense forest, included underground chambers that Samuel had excavated during the previous summer under the pretense of creating emergency shelters. Heinrich's elimination was accomplished through a combination of physical restraint and induced suffocation that left no obvious signs of violence while ensuring that death occurred slowly enough to allow for the extraction of useful information about the victim's background, connections, and potential value to the family's broader operations. The processing of Heinrich's remains followed procedures that Rebecca Stonehurst had developed through her study of anatomical texts and her observations of local butchering practices. The systematic dismemberment and disposal of body parts served both practical and psychological purposes, eliminating physical evidence while reinforcing the family's control over life and death within their isolated domain. Anna Müller and her children were told that Heinrich's pilgrimage had been extended due to the importance of his divine mission, and that maintaining faith in his eventual return represented a crucial test of their own spiritual development. The months that followed Heinrich's disappearance provided the Stonehurst family with opportunities to study Anna's psychological responses and plan the most effective approach for her own eventual elimination. The success of Heinrich's disposal encouraged the family to accelerate their timeline for processing other potentially problematic community members. Within 6 months, 3 additional individuals had been selected for special missions from which they would never return, establishing a pattern that would continue with increasing frequency over the following decade. The selection criteria for elimination targets reflected the family's sophisticated understanding of social dynamics and risk management. Priority was given to individuals who possessed knowledge or skills that could threaten the family's operations, those who had expressed doubts about community leadership, and anyone who maintained connections to the outside world that might result in unwanted investigations. Martha Stonehurst proved particularly skilled at identifying community members whose elimination would serve multiple purposes. Her ability to detect signs of growing resistance or potential disloyalty allowed the family to address threats before they could develop into serious challenges to their authority. The practical aspects of victim processing required continuous refinement as the family gained experience and expanded their operations. Thomas Whitmore's knowledge of bureaucratic procedures proved invaluable for creating false documentation that explained the absence of eliminated community members and provided cover stories for their disappearance from official records. The underground facilities that Samuel had initially constructed for processing individual victims were expanded into a complex system of chambers and tunnels that could accommodate multiple simultaneous operations. The remote location and sophisticated concealment methods ensured that the family's activities remained hidden from any potential investigators who might venture into the area. Rebecca Stonehurst's medical knowledge allowed the family to harvest valuable materials from their victims before disposal, including gold dental work, jewelry, and personal items that could be sold to generate additional revenue for the community's operations. Her systematic approach to body processing also ensured that remains were disposed of in ways that minimized the risk of discovery while maximizing the efficiency of the elimination process. The psychological impact of the disappearances on surviving community members was carefully managed through a combination of religious indoctrination and social pressure that discouraged questions about the fate of those who had been called away on divine missions. The Stonehurst family understood that maintaining the facade of spiritual purpose was essential to preventing panic and potential rebellion among the remaining population. By the end of 1898, the New Eden community had lost 7 members to the Stonehurst family's elimination program, while gaining 12 new arrivals who had been recruited through the family's expanding network of contacts throughout New England. The growing efficiency of their operations gave the family confidence that they had developed a sustainable system for processing human resources while maintaining the protective cover of religious community. The evolution of the Stonehurst family's elimination system during 1899 reflected their growing expertise in identifying optimal targets and refining their processing methods. The lessons learned from their initial operations led to the development of sophisticated criteria for victim selection that maximized both profit and security while minimizing the risk of outside interference. The family's victim selection process began with comprehensive background investigations conducted by their network of scouts throughout New England. These investigations focused on identifying individuals whose disappearance would generate minimal concern from law enforcement or family members, while simultaneously assessing the potential value of their personal assets and specialized knowledge. Priority targets included recent immigrants who had not yet established strong social connections in their new communities, widows and widowers without extensive family networks, and individuals suffering from financial difficulties that made them particularly susceptible to offers of assistance and new opportunities. The family also showed increasing interest in recruiting people with valuable skills such as medical training, mechanical expertise, or literacy in multiple languages. Martha Stonehurst developed a systematic approach to psychological profiling that allowed the family to predict which potential victims would adapt most readily to community life and which would require immediate elimination due to their likelihood of causing problems. Her observations focused on identifying signs of independent thinking, strong family loyalty, or previous experience with religious communities that might make individuals resistant to the family's control methods. The physical infrastructure supporting the family's operations expanded significantly during this period, with Samuel Stonehurst supervising the construction of additional underground facilities that could accommodate larger numbers of victims while providing improved security and efficiency. The new chambers included specialized areas for interrogation, processing, and storage that reflected the family's growing understanding of their operational requirements. Rebecca Stonehurst's medical knowledge proved increasingly valuable as the family refined their elimination methods to maximize the extraction of useful materials while ensuring that victims remained conscious and responsive during questioning. Her techniques for inducing controllable levels of pain and disorientation allowed the family to obtain detailed information about victims' backgrounds, connections, and assets before proceeding with final elimination. The interrogation procedures developed by the family served multiple purposes beyond simply gathering intelligence about their victims. The systematic extraction of personal information allowed them to create detailed profiles that could be used to impersonate victims in correspondence with outside contacts, while the psychological breakdown that resulted from prolonged questioning made victims more compliant and less likely to attempt escape or resistance. Thomas Whitmore's expertise in document creation and modification became increasingly sophisticated as the family expanded their operations to include more complex scenarios involving the disappearance of entire families. His ability to create false death certificates, property transfer documents, and correspondence from supposed relatives allowed the family to provide convincing explanations for the absence of eliminated community members. The family's financial operations during this period reflected their growing confidence in their ability to process victims efficiently while maintaining their cover as a legitimate religious community. The systematic appropriation of victim assets, combined with the sale of harvested materials and personal belongings, generated sufficient revenue to fund continued expansion while providing the family with substantial personal wealth. The recruitment network that supplied new victims to the New Eden community expanded to include contacts in major cities throughout New England, with particular emphasis on areas experiencing economic hardship or social disruption that created large populations of vulnerable individuals. The family scouts were provided with detailed guidelines for identifying optimal targets and approaches for making initial contact without arousing suspicion. The seasonal patterns that emerged in the family's operations reflected both practical considerations and strategic planning designed to minimize the risk of discovery. Winter months, when travel to and from Cedar Falls was most difficult, were reserved for processing previously recruited victims, while spring and summer periods focused on recruitment activities and the integration of new arrivals into the community. The psychological conditioning techniques employed by the family became increasingly sophisticated as they gained experience in breaking down individual resistance and creating dependency relationships that made victims less likely to question their circumstances or attempt escape. The combination of religious indoctrination, social isolation, and carefully controlled access to basic necessities created an environment where victims became complicit in their own exploitation. Martha Stonehurst's role in managing the emotional aspects of victim processing proved crucial to the family's success in maintaining order within the community while simultaneously eliminating potential threats. Her ability to provide comfort and apparent understanding to distressed community members made her an effective tool for identifying individuals who were beginning to question their circumstances or develop plans for leaving New Eden. The family's understanding of law enforcement limitations and jurisdictional complications allowed them to exploit weaknesses in the existing system for investigating missing persons and suspicious activities in remote areas. The lack of communication infrastructure and the general reluctance of local authorities to investigate activities within religious communities provided additional protection for their operations. By the end of 1899, the Stonehurst family had successfully eliminated 19 community members while recruiting 28 new arrivals, demonstrating their ability to maintain a stable population while continuously processing victims. The refinement of their selection criteria and processing methods had created a sustainable operation that could continue indefinitely without attracting unwanted attention from outside authorities. The confidence gained from their successful operations during 1899 led the family to begin planning for a significant expansion of their activities that would allow them to process larger numbers of victims while exploring new methods for recruiting targets from populations beyond their traditional focus on economically disadvantaged individuals seeking religious guidance and community support. The year 1902 marked the pinnacle of the Stonehurst family's criminal enterprise, as their operations reached a level of efficiency and scope that transformed New Eden from a small religious community into a sophisticated processing center for human elimination. The family's success in avoiding detection while dramatically increasing their victim count demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of their systematic approach to mass murder. The expansion of their network during this period included the recruitment of accomplices in Boston, Providence, and Hartford who served as talent scouts for identifying optimal targets among the urban populations of displaced workers, recent immigrants, and families facing economic hardship. These accomplices, often legitimate business owners or social workers, were compensated through a percentage of the assets recovered from victims they successfully directed to New Eden. Jeremiah Stonehurst's reputation as a charismatic religious leader had spread throughout New England, attracting visitors and potential converts who viewed New Eden as a beacon of spiritual purity in an increasingly corrupt world. The family exploited this reputation by hosting summer revival meetings that drew hundreds of attendees, providing opportunities to identify and recruit victims while maintaining their facade as devout Christians committed to helping the less fortunate. The infrastructure supporting the family's peak operations included a network of way stations between major cities and Cedar Falls where potential victims could be housed temporarily while their backgrounds were verified and their processing plans were finalized. These facilities, typically abandoned farms or unused commercial buildings, were staffed by trusted accomplices who understood their role in the larger operation. Samuel Stonehurst had developed a mobile elimination unit that could process victims at remote locations throughout New England, allowing the family to expand their operations beyond the confines of Cedar Falls while maintaining the security advantages of their mountain stronghold. This unit included specialized equipment for interrogation, processing, and disposal that could be transported quickly and efficiently to predetermined sites. The interrogation techniques perfected by Rebecca Stonehurst during this period allowed the family to extract comprehensive information about victims' financial assets, family connections, and personal histories that proved invaluable for both operational security and profit maximization. Her methods for inducing psychological breakdown while maintaining physical consciousness enabled extended questioning sessions that revealed details victims would never have disclosed under normal circumstances. The family's financial operations had evolved into a sophisticated system for converting victim assets into untraceable wealth through a network of corrupt merchants, bankers, and property dealers who asked no questions about the source of goods and currencies being exchanged. The profits generated from these activities funded continued expansion while providing the family with resources for maintaining their cover as successful religious entrepreneurs. Martha Stonehurst's management of the community's daily operations had reached a level of efficiency that allowed the simultaneous processing of multiple victims while maintaining the appearance of normal religious community life for newer arrivals and potential converts. Her ability to compartmentalize information and maintain operational security among community members prevented the development of suspicions that might have led to investigations or escape attempts. The seasonal harvest periods that the family had established for intensive victim processing coincided with natural cycles that provided both practical advantages and symbolic significance for their elimination activities. Spring and fall operations were planned to take advantage of favorable weather conditions for transportation and disposal while incorporating religious themes that reinforced the spiritual justification for their actions. If this systematic elimination of hundreds of innocent people is sending chills down your spine, you're witnessing one of the most calculated examples of evil hiding behind religious authority in American history. Take a moment to share this video with someone who needs to understand how dangerous charismatic leaders can become when they operate without oversight. Hit that like button to show your support for bringing these buried stories to light, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss our investigations into the crimes that authorities try to erase from history. The psychological conditioning programs developed for managing large numbers of potential victims simultaneously required sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and individual psychology that demonstrated the family's evolution from opportunistic criminals to systematic predators. The techniques they employed for breaking down resistance and creating dependency relationships allowed them to maintain control over dozens of individuals while simultaneously processing others for elimination. The family's intelligence network had expanded to include contacts within law enforcement agencies, government offices, and religious organizations who provided advance warning of potential investigations while supplying information about individuals who might prove valuable targets. These accomplices were typically compensated through monetary payments or assistance with their own criminal activities rather than direct involvement in elimination operations. Thomas Whitmore's document creation capabilities had evolved to include sophisticated forgeries that could withstand casual inspection by law enforcement or financial institutions, allowing the family to maintain elaborate fictional explanations for the disappearance of entire families while transferring their assets to accounts controlled by the Stonehurst network. His expertise in bureaucratic procedures enabled the family to manipulate official records in ways that made their victims effectively disappear from legal existence. The underground facilities at Cedar Falls had been expanded into a complex that could accommodate the processing of multiple victims simultaneously while providing secure storage for harvested materials and disposal of remains. The engineering sophistication of these installations reflected Samuel Stonehurst's growing expertise in construction techniques that maximized both efficiency and concealment. The community's external reputation during this peak period attracted favorable attention from religious publications and reform organizations who praised New Eden as an example of successful Christian communalism that demonstrated the possibility of creating heaven on earth through faith and dedication. These endorsements provided additional protection from suspicion while attracting new victims who viewed the community's apparent success as validation of their decision to abandon their previous lives. By the end of 1902, the Stonehurst family had processed over 150 victims while maintaining a community population that appeared stable and prosperous to outside observers. Their success in achieving this level of operation while avoiding detection demonstrated the terrifying potential for systematic evil to flourish when criminals possess sufficient intelligence, resources, and protection from accountability. The first serious threat to the Stonehurst family's operations emerged in August 1904 when State Inspector William Crenshaw arrived in Cedar Falls to investigate reports of irregularities in county records that suggested possible fraud in property transfers and missing person reports. Crenshaw's unexpected appearance forced the family to implement emergency security protocols that had been developed for precisely such contingencies. The inspector's investigation focused initially on discrepancies between official death certificates and burial records that Thomas Whitmore had created to explain the disappearance of numerous New Eden community members. Crenshaw had identified patterns in the documentation that suggested systematic falsification designed to cover up suspicious circumstances surrounding multiple deaths over an unusually short time period. Martha Stonehurst assumed primary responsibility for managing the family's response to Crenshaw's investigation, utilizing her reputation as a respected community leader and healer to deflect suspicion while gathering intelligence about the scope and focus of his inquiries. Her ability to present herself as a cooperative and concerned citizen proved crucial in preventing the inspector from gaining access to areas where evidence of the family's activities might be discovered. The elimination of Inspector Crenshaw required careful planning that would avoid attracting additional attention from state authorities while ensuring that his investigation died with him. The family decided to arrange an apparent accident that would be consistent with the dangerous conditions that existed in the mountainous terrain surrounding Cedar Falls during the summer months when sudden storms and flash floods posed genuine threats to travelers. Samuel Stonehurst's mobile elimination unit proved invaluable for processing Crenshaw at a location sufficiently removed from New Eden to avoid connecting his death to the community while creating physical evidence that supported the family's cover story about a tragic accident. The inspector's body was positioned in a ravine where it would be discovered by search parties after an appropriate interval, showing signs of injuries consistent with a fall during severe weather. The successful elimination of Inspector Crenshaw demonstrated the family's ability to neutralize official threats to their operations, but also highlighted the increasing risk that their activities were beginning to attract unwanted attention from authorities who possessed resources and authority that exceeded anything they had previously encountered. This realization led to significant modifications in their security procedures and operational protocols. Rebecca Stonehurst developed enhanced interrogation techniques specifically designed to identify potential informants or investigators who might be attempting to infiltrate the community under false pretenses. Her methods for detecting deception and extracting truthful information from suspicious individuals allowed the family to maintain operational security while eliminating threats before they could develop into serious problems. The witness elimination protocols implemented during this period reflected the family's understanding that their long-term survival required the systematic removal of anyone who possessed knowledge that could threaten their operations. These protocols included both community members who had observed suspicious activities and outside individuals who had encountered evidence of the family's crimes. The case of Margaret Foster illustrated the ruthless efficiency with which the family addressed potential witnesses to their activities. Foster, a traveling nurse who had stopped in Cedar Falls to treat a sick child, had observed inconsistencies in the community's population and asked questions about missing individuals whose belongings she had noticed in various buildings throughout New Eden. Foster's elimination was accomplished through a carefully staged medical emergency that allowed Rebecca Stonehurst to administer fatal substances while providing apparent medical treatment for a sudden illness. The nurse's death was attributed to a rare allergic reaction that could not have been predicted or prevented, eliminating suspicion while removing a witness who posed an immediate threat to operational security. The security measures implemented following the Crenshaw investigation included the establishment of lookout posts along all routes leading to Cedar Falls, staffed by community members who had been trained to identify potential threats and communicate warnings to the family through predetermined signals. These measures provided advance warning of approaching visitors while allowing the family to prepare appropriate responses to different types of potential threats. The underground facilities were modified to include concealed entrances and emergency escape routes that would allow the family to avoid detection even if their property was subjected to thorough searches by law enforcement agencies. Samuel Stonehurst's engineering expertise proved crucial in creating hiding places and disposal systems that could withstand casual inspection while providing rapid access when operational requirements demanded immediate action. Thomas Whitmore's intelligence network was expanded to include contacts within state government offices who could provide advance warning of official investigations or policy changes that might affect the family's operations. These contacts were carefully cultivated through a combination of monetary incentives and compromising information that ensured their continued cooperation while minimizing the risk of betrayal. The family's response to increased scrutiny included the development of alternative cover stories and false identities that could be activated quickly if circumstances required them to abandon their current operations and relocate to a different area. These contingency plans included prepositioned resources and accomplice networks that would allow them to resume their activities with minimal interruption if Cedar Falls became untenable. The psychological conditioning of community members was intensified to ensure absolute loyalty and prevent the development of doubts or questions that might lead to cooperation with outside investigators. The family implemented enhanced surveillance and control measures that monitored all interactions between community members while reinforcing the religious justifications for their authority and the consequences of betrayal. Martha Stonehurst's management of community morale during this period of heightened security required sophisticated manipulation techniques that maintained the appearance of normal religious community life while implementing the restrictions and surveillance measures necessary for operational security. Her ability to present security protocols as spiritual practices helped prevent community members from recognizing the true nature of their situation. The successful navigation of the Crenshaw investigation provided the family with valuable experience in dealing with official threats while demonstrating their ability to eliminate problems through violence when other methods proved insufficient. However, the increased attention from state authorities also highlighted the growing risks associated with their expanding operations and the need for enhanced caution in future activities. By the end of 1904, the Stonehurst family had eliminated 7 potential witnesses and threats to their operations while successfully deflecting an official investigation that could have exposed their crimes. Their ability to maintain operational security under pressure demonstrated the sophisticated nature of their criminal enterprise while revealing the terrifying extent of their willingness to use violence to protect their activities. The disappearance of Inspector Crenshaw had the unintended consequence of attracting attention from his supervisor, Chief Inspector Daniel Morrison, who arrived in the region during the spring of 1905 with a mandate to complete Crenshaw's investigation while determining the circumstances surrounding his colleague's death. Morrison brought with him resources and authority that far exceeded anything the Stonehurst family had previously encountered. Unlike the local authorities who had proven susceptible to intimidation and corruption, Morrison represented the emerging professionalization of law enforcement that emphasized systematic investigation techniques and interagency cooperation. His background included experience with complex fraud cases and organized criminal activities that had given him sophisticated understanding of how criminals operated and the methods they employed to avoid detection. The investigation that Morrison launched differed fundamentally from previous inquiries into activities in Cedar Falls. Rather than focusing solely on specific incidents or missing persons reports, he approached the case as a comprehensive examination of patterns and anomalies that might reveal systematic criminal activity disguised as legitimate religious community operations. Morrison's methodology included detailed analysis of financial records, property transfers, and population movements that revealed discrepancies between official documentation and observable reality in the Cedar Falls area. His investigation quickly identified irregularities in birth and death records that suggested widespread falsification designed to conceal suspicious activities involving large numbers of people. The scope of Morrison's investigation extended beyond the immediate vicinity of New Eden to include examination of recruitment networks and supply chains that connected the community to urban centers throughout New England. This broader perspective allowed him to identify patterns of missing persons and suspicious property transfers that painted a disturbing picture of organized criminal activity. Sheriff William Hayes found himself under increasing pressure to cooperate with Morrison's investigation, despite his previous arrangements with the Whitmore family and other local interests that had benefited from ignoring suspicious activities in the mountain communities. The federal authority backing Morrison's investigation made resistance or obstruction impossible without risking criminal charges. The family's intelligence network provided advance warning of Morrison's investigation, allowing them to implement emergency protocols designed to minimize evidence while maintaining their cover as a legitimate religious community. However, the comprehensive nature of Morrison's approach made it impossible to conceal all traces of their activities through simple document destruction or witness elimination. Martha Stonehurst recognized that their traditional methods for managing official inquiries would prove inadequate against Morrison's systematic investigation. The family needed to develop new strategies that could withstand sustained scrutiny while preserving their ability to continue operations or facilitate a strategic withdrawal if circumstances made Cedar Falls untenable. The first significant breakthrough in Morrison's investigation came when he located Sarah Mitchell, a former New Eden community member who had escaped during the winter of 1903 and had been living in Boston under an assumed name. Mitchell possessed detailed knowledge of the community's internal operations and had witnessed activities that contradicted the family's claims about their religious mission. Mitchell's testimony provided Morrison with specific allegations about disappearances, suspicious deaths, and systematic fraud that formed the foundation for a formal criminal investigation. Her willingness to cooperate with authorities despite obvious personal risk demonstrated the compelling nature of the evidence she could provide against the Stonehurst family. The family's response to Mitchell's cooperation with Morrison included immediate plans for her elimination, but the investigator's protection of his key witness made direct action impossible without confirming the very allegations they were trying to discredit. This situation forced the family to rely on intimidation and character assassination rather than their preferred method of physical elimination. Rebecca Stonehurst assumed responsibility for developing psychological warfare tactics designed to undermine Mitchell's credibility while creating doubt about her mental stability and reliability as a witness. These efforts included spreading rumors about Mitchell's supposed history of mental illness and her alleged involvement in immoral activities that might discredit her testimony. If you're beginning to understand how close these monsters came to escaping justice entirely, you're witnessing the critical moment when their carefully constructed facade began to crumble. The courage of survivors like Sarah Mitchell reminds us why these stories must be told, no matter how difficult they are to hear. Take a moment to share this video with someone who appreciates the importance of holding criminals accountable, even decades after their crimes. Hit that like button to support our commitment to exposing the truth about America's hidden history, and make sure you're subscribed to our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these victims be forgotten. The community members remaining in New Eden during Morrison's investigation were subjected to intensive psychological conditioning designed to ensure their loyalty while preparing them for potential questioning by authorities. The family implemented enhanced surveillance and control measures that monitored all communications while reinforcing the religious justifications for absolute obedience to community leadership. Samuel Stonehurst began developing contingency plans for the evacuation of essential personnel and resources if Morrison's investigation progressed to the point where arrests became imminent. These plans included predetermined escape routes, false identities, and prepositioned assets that would allow the family to resume operations in a different location if Cedar Falls became untenable. The family's financial operations were restructured to minimize evidence of their criminal activities while ensuring that accumulated wealth could be accessed quickly if circumstances required immediate departure. Thomas Whitmore's expertise in document creation proved crucial for establishing alternative identities and financial accounts that could support the family's operations regardless of the outcome of Morrison's investigation. The psychological pressure created by Morrison's investigation began to affect community members who had not previously questioned the family's authority or the explanations provided for various disappearances and suspicious events. The increased scrutiny and growing awareness of outside interest in their activities created an atmosphere of tension and uncertainty that threatened the family's ability to maintain control. Morrison's investigation had reached a critical point where the accumulation of evidence and witness testimony was beginning to create a compelling case for criminal prosecution. The family understood that their window for effective countermeasures was rapidly closing and that decisive action would be required to prevent the complete exposure of their operations. The growing suspicion surrounding the New Eden community had attracted attention from religious organizations and reform groups who were beginning to question whether the community represented legitimate Christian practice or something far more sinister. This additional scrutiny created pressure from multiple directions that made it increasingly difficult for the family to maintain their protective facade. By the summer of 1905, the Stonehurst family faced the most serious threat to their operation since their arrival in Cedar Falls. Morrison's investigation had progressed beyond simple inquiry into systematic evidence gathering that would soon provide sufficient basis for formal criminal charges and the complete dismantling of their elaborate criminal enterprise. Sarah Mitchell's detailed testimony to Chief Inspector Morrison revealed the horrifying scope of the Stonehurst family's operations from the perspective of someone who had lived within the community for nearly 2 years before her desperate escape. Her account provided Morrison with specific dates, locations, and methods that transformed his investigation from speculation based on statistical anomalies into a criminal case supported by eyewitness evidence. Mitchell described the systematic process by which new arrivals were evaluated, conditioned, and ultimately selected for elimination based on criteria that prioritized operational security and profit maximization over any pretense of religious mission. Her observations included detailed descriptions of the underground facilities, the interrogation procedures, and the disposal methods that the family had refined over years of practice. The former community members' testimony included specific information about the fates of individuals whose disappearances had been reported to various law enforcement agencies throughout New England. Her ability to provide names, dates, and circumstances for dozens of victims gave Morrison the evidence needed to connect previously unrelated missing person cases into a comprehensive pattern of systematic murder. Morrison's investigation team expanded to include specialists in document analysis, financial crimes, and forensic examination who could verify the details provided by Mitchell while uncovering additional evidence that supported her allegations. The collaborative approach reflected the growing sophistication of law enforcement techniques that made it increasingly difficult for organized criminals to operate with impunity. The financial investigation conducted by Morrison's team revealed the complex network of accounts, property transfers, and business relationships that the Stonehurst family had used to convert victim assets into personal wealth. The paper trail documented transactions totaling hundreds of thousands of dollars that could not be explained through legitimate community activities or religious donations. Physical evidence supporting Mitchell's testimony was discovered when Morrison's team located several of the way stations that the family had used for temporary housing and processing of victims during transportation to Cedar Falls. These facilities contained personal belongings, documentation, and physical traces that corroborated specific incidents described in Mitchell's account of the family's operations. The discovery of mass burial sites in locations identified by Mitchell provided the most compelling evidence of the family's crimes while revealing the true scope of their elimination activities. The systematic arrangement of remains and the presence of personal items confirmed that the deaths had resulted from deliberate murder rather than natural causes or accidental circumstances. Jeremiah Stonehurst's response to the mounting evidence against his family reflected the psychological deterioration that often accompanies the collapse of elaborate criminal enterprises. His increasingly erratic behavior and paranoid accusations against community members created an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that accelerated the breakdown of the social control mechanisms that had previously maintained order within New Eden. The family's internal dynamics became increasingly strained as individual members began to recognize the impossibility of maintaining their operations in the face of Morrison's investigation. Martha Stonehurst advocated for immediate evacuation and relocation, while Samuel argued for violent resistance that would eliminate the investigation through force rather than retreat. Rebecca Stonehurst's medical knowledge became focused on developing methods for eliminating remaining community members who possessed knowledge that could be used against the family in criminal proceedings. Her systematic approach to witness elimination reflected the family's understanding that their survival depended on ensuring that no one remained alive who could provide testimony about their activities. The community members who remained in New Eden during this period found themselves trapped between their fear of the Stonehurst family and their growing awareness that law enforcement agencies were closing in on the community. The psychological pressure created by this situation led to increased attempts to escape, which the family met with escalating violence and intimidation. Thomas Whitmore's intelligence network provided increasingly desperate reports about the progress of Morrison's investigation and the likelihood that formal charges would be filed within weeks rather than months. The information confirmed that the family's time in Cedar Falls was limited and that decisive action would be required to prevent their capture and prosecution. The family's contingency plans for evacuation were complicated by the need to eliminate evidence and witnesses while avoiding actions that would provide Morrison with additional proof of their criminal activities. The balance between security and self-preservation became increasingly difficult to maintain as the investigation progressed toward its inevitable conclusion. Morrison's protection of Sarah Mitchell included not only physical security but also efforts to locate and protect other potential witnesses who might have knowledge of the family's activities. This approach reflected his understanding that the case against the Stonehurst family would require multiple sources of testimony to withstand the sophisticated legal defense that their accumulated wealth could purchase. The psychological profile that Morrison developed of the Stonehurst family operation revealed the systematic nature of their crimes and the calculated planning that had allowed them to avoid detection for nearly a decade. His analysis provided insights into their methods and motivations that would prove crucial for preventing similar operations in the future. The evidence gathered by Morrison's investigation team included financial records, personal belongings of victims, testimony from survivors and witnesses, and physical evidence from crime scenes that created a comprehensive case for prosecution. The systematic documentation of the family's activities provided a blueprint for understanding how organized criminals could exploit religious communities and isolated locations to commit crimes on a massive scale. The family's growing paranoia manifested in increasingly violent responses to perceived threats within the community, as they began eliminating long-term members who had previously been considered trustworthy. This acceleration of violence reflected their recognition that their carefully constructed operation was collapsing and that desperate measures were required to maintain control. The final weeks of the Stonehurst family's operation in Cedar Falls were characterized by a combination of frantic preparation for evacuation and systematic elimination of evidence and witnesses that could be used against them in criminal proceedings. Their actions during this period provided Morrison with additional evidence of their guilt while demonstrating the ruthless determination that had characterized their criminal enterprise from its inception. By the autumn of 1905, Morrison's investigation had assembled sufficient evidence to support criminal charges against all members of the Stonehurst family while documenting the scope and methods of their operation in unprecedented detail. The case represented a watershed moment in the development of modern law enforcement techniques for investigating complex criminal conspiracies that operated across multiple jurisdictions and extended over many years. The confrontation that would ultimately destroy the Stonehurst family's criminal empire began on October 15, 1905, when Chief Inspector Morrison arrived at the gates of New Eden with a team of federal marshals and a warrant authorizing the search of all buildings and property associated with the religious community. The family's network of lookouts had provided advance warning, but their options for response were limited by the scope and authority of the approaching law enforcement operation. Jeremiah Stonehurst's decision to resist the investigation through direct confrontation rather than strategic withdrawal reflected the psychological breakdown that had accelerated during the previous months of mounting pressure. His grandiose delusions about divine protection and his inability to accept the reality of his situation led him to believe that violent resistance could succeed where careful planning had failed. The family's attempt to eliminate all remaining witnesses before Morrison's arrival resulted in a massacre that claimed the lives of 17 community members during the 36 hours preceding the law enforcement operation. Rebecca Stonehurst's medical expertise was employed to ensure that the killings appeared to result from a sudden outbreak of disease rather than deliberate murder, but the systematic nature of the deaths created evidence that would later prove crucial for prosecution. Samuel Stonehurst supervised the destruction of documentary evidence and the concealment of physical materials that could link the family to their criminal activities. However, the scope of their operation made complete elimination of evidence impossible within the limited time available, and Morrison's team would later discover substantial proof of the family's crimes despite their desperate efforts at concealment. The underground facilities that had served as the center of the family's elimination operations became the focus of frantic efforts to remove or destroy evidence of their activities. The family's attempts to collapse the tunnels and chambers through controlled explosions succeeded only partially, leaving enough physical evidence intact to support the most serious charges against them. Martha Stonehurst's role during the final crisis involved coordinating the family's response while attempting to maintain the facade of religious community leadership that had protected them for nearly a decade. Her efforts to present the approaching investigation as religious persecution designed to destroy their Christian community reflected the psychological defense mechanisms that had allowed the family to justify their crimes. The discovery of Thomas Whitmore's document creation facility provided Morrison's team with evidence of the sophisticated forgery operation that had enabled the family to conceal their victims' disappearances while appropriating their assets. The equipment and partially completed documents revealed the scope and technical sophistication of the family's efforts to maintain their criminal enterprise through systematic falsification of official records. Morrison's tactical approach to the search operation reflected his understanding of the family's dangerous capabilities and their willingness to use violence to protect their interests. The coordinated deployment of federal marshals and state investigators ensured that the family could not eliminate additional witnesses or destroy evidence during the search process. The confrontation reached its climax when Samuel Stonehurst attempted to ambush Morrison's advance team using explosives that had been prepared for destroying evidence. The resulting explosion killed 2 federal marshals and wounded several others, while providing unmistakable proof of the family's violent intentions and their guilt regarding the charges being investigated. Jeremiah Stonehurst's capture occurred only after a prolonged standoff during which he threatened to detonate additional explosives that would destroy the remaining underground facilities and any evidence they contained. His eventual surrender came only when Morrison's negotiators convinced him that his explosive devices had been disabled by his son's premature detonation of the primary charge. The systematic search of the New Eden property revealed evidence that exceeded even Morrison's expectations regarding the scope and brutality of the family's criminal activities. The discovery of detailed records documenting hundreds of victims, along with physical evidence of torture, medical experimentation, and systematic murder, provided compelling proof of crimes that shocked even experienced law enforcement professionals. Rebecca Stonehurst's attempt to destroy her medical records and experimental documentation was only partially successful, leaving enough evidence to reveal the horrifying extent of her involvement in torturing victims while extracting information and conducting unauthorized medical procedures. Her activities represented some of the most disturbing aspects of the family's criminal enterprise. The family's financial records, despite significant destruction attempts, provided sufficient evidence to trace the disposition of victim assets and reveal the scope of their profit from systematic murder. The documentation showed that the family had accumulated wealth equivalent to several $1 million in contemporary currency through their elimination operations. Martha Stonehurst's final act of defiance involved an attempt to poison the remaining community members to prevent their cooperation with Morrison's investigation. Her effort was detected and prevented, but not before 3 additional deaths occurred, bringing the total number of victims claimed during the family's final crisis to 20 individuals. The capture of the surviving Stonehurst family members marked the end of an operation that had claimed 291 lives over 13 years while generating enormous profits through systematic murder disguised as religious community activities. The evidence gathered during Morrison's investigation would provide the foundation for prosecutions that would establish important precedents for addressing organized criminal activities that exploited religious institutions and isolated communities. The psychological evaluation of the captured family members revealed the extent to which they had developed elaborate justifications for their criminal activities while maintaining their self-image as devout Christians engaged in divine work. Their ability to compartmentalize their actions and rationalize mass murder as religious duty provided disturbing insights into the psychology of organized criminal enterprises. The immediate aftermath of the raid included efforts to identify and notify families of victims whose remains had been discovered on the property, while investigators worked to piece together the full scope of the family's criminal network throughout New England. The complexity of the case required months of additional investigation to understand the complete extent of their activities. Morrison's final assessment of the Stonehurst case emphasized the sophisticated planning and systematic execution that had enabled the family to operate with impunity for over a decade while claiming hundreds of lives. His analysis provided crucial insights for developing law enforcement strategies to prevent similar operations in the future. The evidence collected during the investigation filled over 200 boxes and included documentation that would take years to fully analyze and catalog. The scope and detail of the material provided unprecedented insight into the methods and motivations of organized criminals who had exploited religious authority to commit crimes on an industrial scale.